History books claim the Oakhaven fires of 1492 were a tragic accident. They lie. That night, a ruthless Alpha King walked into a subterranean flesh market, paid a king's ransom for the world's last living Omega, and burned an empire of monsters to ashes to ensure her absolute freedom. According to the private diaries of Lord Wallace of the Northern Wastes documents, only declassified from the Royal Archives 3 centuries later, the species known as the Omega was thought to be entirely extinct by the late 15th century. The Great Purge, a brutal campaign led by paranoid pack leaders who feared the pacifying, unifying aura of Omegas, had wiped them from the continent. Or so the world believed. Alicia Mercer was a ghost living in a world of predators. For 22 years, she survived in the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the Ironwood Basin, hiding her true nature with meticulous, agonizing care. The life of an Omega in hiding was not one of peace. It was a daily, grueling regimen of survival. To mask the intoxicating, sweet pheromones unique to her bloodline, Alicia bathed in rivers laced with crushed pine, rubbed ash into her skin, and ingested microdoses of nightshade to suppress her natural heat cycles. She lived as a nameless drifter, a supposed rogue beta, moving from village to village. But perfection is a fragile illusion. The historical accounts from the mercenary captain Garrett Thorne, no relation to the royal lineages, detail exactly how her deception unraveled. It was a torrential evening in late autumn. Alicia had sought shelter in a dilapidated tavern on the outskirts of Brimstone, a notoriously lawless territory. She was exhausted, shivering, and critically, she had run out of her suppressing herbs. As the damp warmth of the hearth thawed her freezing limbs, the ash and pine washed away, and a singular, undeniable scent bloomed in the crowded room. It was described in Thorne's surviving ledgers as the scent of a sunlit orchard after a brutal winter. It took less than 5 minutes for the tavern to devolve into a bloodbath. Feral, unattached alphas, driven into a frenzy by an instinct they hadn't felt in generations, tore each other apart just to get near her. But it was the organized syndicate, the flesh weavers of Brimstone, who ultimately claimed the prize. Heavy iron nets, soaked in liquid silver, were thrown over her. She was beaten into submission, heavily sedated with wolfsbane, and dragged into the darkness. When Alicia awoke, she was no longer in the mortal world. She had been taken to the undercity of Oakhaven, a labyrinthine network of catacombs where the wealthiest, most depraved members of werewolf high society conducted their illicit trade. The auction house, known in whispered rumors as the Obsidian Hall, was a cavernous amphitheater carved from black volcanic rock. The cages were suspended over a glowing chasm of molten slag, ensuring the captives remained terrified and compliant. Alicia was placed in a reinforced silver glass enclosure. She was stripped of her ragged travel clothes and dressed in a sheer, humiliating garment of spun gold and white silk, a stark, deliberate contrast to the filth of her capture. A heavy, intricate silver collar was fastened around her throat, a brutal mechanism rigged with hidden barbs that would deploy if she tried to shift or use her latent Omega abilities to soothe her captors. Tristan Harrow, the mastermind behind the Obsidian Hall, recognized exactly what he had. Harrow was a rogue alpha, a sadist who wore tailored velvet coats and masked his cruelty behind a veneer of aristocratic civility. Surviving ledger entries found in the ruins of his estate confirm he sent encrypted missives to the continent's most powerful monarchs and warlords. The message was simple. The myth breathes. The last Omega will be sold to the highest bidder at the winter solstice. Alicia sat in the center of her glass prison, her knees pulled to her chest, her amber eyes burning with a mixture of profound terror and an unyielding ancient defiance. She watched the elite of her kind file into the amphitheater. They wore masks of porcelain and gold, hiding their identities as they prepared to bid on lives. She could feel their predatory gazes scraping against her skin. She was completely alone, fully believing that this night would be her last night of sanity, that she would be bought, broken, and bred until she died. She did not know that a monster, far more terrifying than Tristan Harrow, had just walked through the iron doors. The air in the obsidian hall was thick with the scent of fine wine, expensive perfumes, and the sour, underlying reek of unbridled greed. Hundreds of masked figures sat in tiered seating, their eyes fixed on the illuminated central stage. Among them, cloaked in a heavy charcoal gray traveling mantle that obscured his massive frame, sat Kaelin Rothberg. To understand the sheer gravity of his presence, one must consult the Times Rothberg Chronicles, a heavily guarded historical text detailing the lineage of the Northern Kings. Kaelin was not just an alpha, he was the Alpha King of the Frost Peaks. He was a warlord of unmatched brutality, a man who had conquered 3 neighboring territories before his 25th winter. But Kaelin harbored a deeply personal hatred for the underground slave trade. His own mother, a low-ranking beta, had been sold in a market much like this one before his father had found her. When Kaelin intercepted one of Tristan Harrow's encrypted missives detailing the sale of an Omega, he did not send an emissary. He came himself, slipping into the city under the guise of a wealthy southern merchant. The auction was a grueling, horrific spectacle. Alicia was forced to watch as lesser lots were paraded across the stage. Captured rogue warriors sold for pit fights, rare mystical artifacts, and stolen land deeds. The anticipation in the room was palpable, a suffocating pressure that made her lungs burn. Finally, as the midnight bell tolled somewhere far above in the surface city, Tristan Harrow took the stage. He tapped a diamond-tipped cane against the stone floor, demanding silence. "My lords, ladies, and esteemed shadows of the night," Harrow's voice echoed, smooth and venomous. "We have traded in gold, in blood, and in secrets. But tonight, I offer you something that transcends wealth. I offer you a piece of history, thought lost to the ashes of the purge. I offer you the ultimate prize." The silver glass cage was lowered from the ceiling by heavy chains, coming to rest in the center of the stage. The moment the enchanted glass was deactivated and retracted, the suppression spells masking her scent were lifted. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A collective, shuddering gasp rippled through the amphitheater. Several alphas in the front rows visibly trembled, their claws extending, tearing into the velvet upholstery of their seats. The scent of the Omega, pure, raw, and intoxicating, flooded the cavern. It was a scent that promised peace, an anchor to the chaotic, rage-filled souls of the alphas. Alicia stood tall despite her trembling legs, refusing to lower her gaze. Her eyes, glowing with a faint, ethereal gold, swept over the crowd of monsters. "The bidding will commence," Harrow announced, a cruel smile twisting his lips, at 100,000 gold sovereigns. It was a sum that could buy a small city, but the paddles flew up in a frenzy. 150! Shouted a masked lord to the left. 200! Roared another from the balconies. 300,000! The numbers climbed with dizzying speed. Alicia felt her heart hammering against her ribs, each bid a nail in her coffin. She looked at the faces of the bidders, seeing only lust, ownership, and madness. 500,000! A voice hissed from the front row. It was Lord Conrad of the Eastern Marshes, a notoriously sadistic alpha known for breaking his concubines. Harrow's eyes gleamed. 500,000 from Lord Conrad. Do I hear 6? The room fell into a tense, agonizing silence. 500,000 was an unfathomable fortune. Even the wealthiest lords hesitated, doing the mental math of mortgaging their entire estates. Harrow raised his gavel, relishing the dramatic pause. "Going once," Harrow called out, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Alicia closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Going twice. 1,000,000 sovereigns. And the deed to the Frost Peak silver mines." The voice did not shout. It did not roar. It was a low, resonant baritone that carried a weight so profound it seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the obsidian hall. Every head in the amphitheater snapped toward the back of the room. Kaelin Rothberg stood up, slowly pulling the charcoal hood back to reveal his face. There was no mask. His striking, angular features were set in stone, his piercing ice-blue eyes locked entirely on the stage. A jagged scar ran down his left cheek, a testament to his violent rise to power. Panic instantly infected the room. Whispers hissed through the rows like a lit fuse. The king, the Alpha King, is here. Harrow's smug demeanor shattered, replaced by a pale, rigid shock. 1,000,000 sovereigns in the Frost Peak mines was a price that could bankroll a continental war. It was completely absurd. It was impossible to outbid. "My Lord Rothberg," Harrow stammered, attempting to regain his composure. "That is an unprecedented offer. Do you have the collateral to verify?" Kalen didn't answer with words. He reached into his heavy coat and tossed a thick, leather-bound ledger, bound in royal seals, onto the floor. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Harrow swallowed hard, looking at the ledger, then at the king, and finally at Elysia. He raised his trembling hand. "Sold," Harrow whispered, striking the gavel. "Sold to King Kalen Rothberg." The transaction of 1,000,000 sovereigns and a royal land deed was not something that could be finalized from across a room. As the echoes of the gavel faded into a suffocating silence, Kalen began his descent down the tiered stone stairs. The crowd parted for him like water breaking against a glacier. No one dared to breathe. The sheer, oppressive aura of his alpha dominance was enough to force weaker wolves to their knees. Elysia watched him approach, her chest heaving. She had heard the stories of the Frost Peak King. They called him the Winter Butcher. They said he had no heart, that he ruled his territory with an iron claw and a sea of blood. As he stepped onto the stage, the sheer size of him became apparent. He towered over Harrow, and when he finally turned his ice-blue eyes onto Elysia, the air in her lungs simply vanished. There was no lust in his gaze, no vile hunger. There was an intense, calculating depth, a storm of suppressed emotion that she could not decipher. Harrow, sweating profusely, signaled for his guards. 6 heavily armed mercenaries stepped forward, forming a protective semicircle around the auctioneer and the prize. Harrow held a small, intricately carved remote device in his hand, his thumb resting nervously over a crimson gemstone embedded in its center. "Your Majesty," Harrow said, forcing a bow that dripped with false reverence. "An honor. Truly, we shall have our scribes draft the transfer of the deeds immediately. In the meantime, the Omega is yours. However," Harrow's smile returned, a desperate cornered smirk, "I must inform you of the security measures, the collar she wears." Kalen stopped a few feet from Elysia. He did not look at Harrow. He looked at the heavy silver band digging into Elysia's delicate neck. "Speak, trafficker," Kalen rumbled, his voice deceptively calm. "The collar is laced with liquid silver and a highly volatile alchemical compound," Harrow explained, taking a step back behind his guards. "It is synced to my heartbeat and this device. Should you attempt to take her without completing the paperwork, or should anyone try to pry it off her neck, it will detonate. It will sever her head from her shoulders in a fraction of a second. The detonator remains with me until the gold is in my vaults." A gasp rippled through the remaining crowd. It was the ultimate insurance policy. Harrow was a coward, but a cunning one. He knew the Alpha King could simply slaughter them all and take the Omega, so he had tied her life directly to his own survival and profit. Elysia closed her eyes, the bitter taste of defeat coating her tongue. She was a weaponized hostage. She looked at Kalen, expecting to see frustration, perhaps anger at the inconvenience. Instead, she saw the king smile. It was a terrifying, feral baring of fangs that promised absolute annihilation. "Tristan Harrow," Kalen said softly, the sound carrying over the dead silent hall. "Do you know why I offered 1,000,000 sovereigns and my most profitable mines?" Harrow blinked, his thumb hovering over the red gem. "Because you value the merchandise, my king." "No," Kalen replied, finally tearing his gaze away from Elysia to lock eyes with the auctioneer. "I offered it because I needed you to drop the gavel. I needed you to publicly, legally, and undeniably declare her as my time's property." Harrow frowned, confusion knitting his brow. I don't understand. She is yours. Just sign the... By the ancient laws of our kind, laws older than this rotting city, what belongs to the Alpha King is under the sovereign protection of the crown. Kaelin's voice began to rise, a thunderous, vibrating frequency that made the stone pillars shudder. To threaten the king's property with an explosive collar is an act of high treason against the Frost Peak throne. Realization crashed over Harrow like an icy wave. He had been outmaneuvered. Kaelin hadn't come to buy her. He had come to create a legal justification for war. "Wait!" Harrow shrieked, lifting the remote. Kaelin moved faster than the human eye could track. There was a blur of motion, the sickening sound of tearing flesh, and a spray of arterial crimson. The crowd erupted into screams. Kaelin stood beside Harrow, holding the auctioneer's severed right arm, still clutching the remote device in his massive hand. Harrow collapsed to the stone floor, screaming in agony as blood pooled around him. The 6 guards lunged forward. Kaelin didn't even draw a blade. He dropped the severed arm carefully to the floor, stepped into the path of the nearest mercenary, and drove his fist straight through the man's chest plate, shattering his ribs and stopping his heart instantly. Chaos descended upon the obsidian hall. The wealthy patrons scrambled over one another, tearing at the heavy iron doors to escape, but the doors had already been barred from the outside. From the shadows of the high balconies, dozens of Kaelin's elite royal guard, who had silently infiltrated the auction house over the past 3 hours, dropped into the amphitheater. They didn't come to arrest anyone. They came with broadswords, battle axes, and torches. "Kill them all!" Kaelin commanded, his voice slicing through the frantic screams. "Every buyer, every guard, every slaver, leave none alive to spread the rot of this place." As the massacre began in earnest, Kaelin turned his back on the carnage and walked toward Alicia. She stood frozen, staring at the blood dripping from his knuckles. He knelt down gracefully, picking up the severed hand still gripping the remote. With terrifying precision, he carefully extracted the device from the dead fingers, pressed a hidden sequence of runes on its side, and unclasped Alicia's collar. The heavy silver fell to the floor with a hollow times clank. Alicia gasped, her hands flying to her bruised throat. She looked down at the Alpha King, her chest heaving. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from years of disuse. "Why do this?" Kaelin stood up, shrugging off his heavy charcoal mantle and wrapping it around her shivering, silk-clad shoulders. The scent of hemp pine, cold mountain air, and iron enveloped her, overwhelming and incredibly safe. "Because, Elysia Mercer," Kaelin said quietly, shocking her by using her true name, one she hadn't spoken aloud in 2 decades. "A queen does not belong in a cage." The obsidian hall burned. The flames, fed by shattered alchemy vials and the igniting subterranean gases of the Undercity, painted the cavern walls in violent strokes of crimson and gold. According to Times, the memoirs of Commander Alden, the captain of the Royal Guard who orchestrated the infiltration, not a single patron who had placed a bid that night made it out of Oakhaven alive. Elysia walked through the massacre, wrapped in the Alpha King's heavy charcoal mantle, untouched by the chaos. Kaelin Rothberg remained firmly at her side, a towering shield of muscle and quiet, terrifying, lethal intent. Where the other alphas in the room had lost themselves to bloodlust or panic, Kaelin moved with chilling, methodical precision. He did not touch her, respecting the boundaries of a woman who had spent a lifetime treating his kind as lethal predators, but his presence was an impenetrable fortress. They emerged from the catacombs into the freezing bite of the winter night. A convoy of heavily armored black carriages awaited them, surrounded by a phalanx of Frost Peak cavalry. "You are safe now," Kaelin said, his deep voice barely audible over the roaring winds. He gestured to the largest carriage, its door held open by Commander Alden. "We ride for the northern mountains. The journey will take a week, but the carriage is heated and provisioned." Elysia hesitated on the step. She clutched the lapels of his massive coat, pulling it tighter around her silk-clad frame. "Safe?" she echoed, her voice laced with bitter skepticism. "You claim a queen does not belong in a cage, King Kaelin, Yet you put me in a gilded box to take me to your fortress. I have traded one captor for another. You paid 1,000,000 sovereigns. You expect a return on your investment." Kalen paused. He looked down at her, his ice blue eyes piercing through the snow and darkness. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't offer a soft, pacifying lie. "I expect nothing," Kalen replied, his tone devoid of the arrogant dominance she was used to hearing from alphas. "I paid 1,000,000 sovereigns to ensure no legal claim could ever be brought against your freedom by the Southern Lords. As for the cage, my citadel has no locks on the inside of its doors. Once we cross the Frost Peak borders, you are free to leave, Elysia. I will give you a horse, provisions, and enough gold to disappear forever. But until we reach my borders, I am your sworn shield." She stared at him, trying to find the deception in his eyes. There was none, only a tired, ancient sense of duty. The journey north was a grueling test of endurance against the elements, but within the carriage, Alicia found a bizarre, unsettling peace. Kalen rode beside her for the entire week, reading through diplomatic missives and territorial maps. He never pushed her to speak. He kept his own alpha aura aggressively suppressed, tightly coiled within himself so that it wouldn't pressure her recovering senses. It was a level of control that bordered on the agonizing. Historical records from the royal physicians noted that suppressing one's aura to such an extreme degree often caused severe physical migraines and muscle spasms in powerful alphas. Yet, Kalen never complained. On the fourth night, as they camped in the shadow of the jagged Spine Mountains, the silence between them finally broke. "How did you know my name?" Elysia asked quietly, staring into the small iron stove burning in the center of the carriage. Kalen set down a scroll sealed with the royal crest. He looked at her for a long moment before reaching into his leather satchel and pulling out a small, decaying journal wrapped in oiled cloth. He handed it to her. 50 years ago, Kalen began, his voice a low rumble. "My grandfather, King Leander, was ambushed in the Ironwood Basin by a coalition of rogue warlords. He was mortally wounded, separated from his guard, and left to die in the snow. He was found by a woman, an Omega." Elysia's breath hitched. She traced the cracked leather of the journal. "My grandmother, Sibylla Mercer." "Yes," Kalen nodded. She did not run from him, even though he was an alpha. She dragged him to a hidden cave. She used her abilities, the natural healing resonance of an Omega's aura, to stabilize his shattered bones and keep him alive until his guard found him. In return, my grandfather swore a blood oath. The Rothberg line would protect the Mercer line until the end of time. But the purge happened shortly after. The warlords, terrified of the Omegas' ability to unite warring packs, systematically hunted your kind. Kalen leaned forward, his massive hands clasped together. "My father spent his entire reign searching for Sibylla's descendants. I have spent mine doing the same." When I saw the name Elysia Mercer in Tristan Harrow's encrypted auction ledger, I didn't come to Oakhaven to buy a wife or a slave. I came to honor a 50-year-old debt. Elysia felt a tear slip down her cheek, landing softly on the cover of her grandmother's journal. For 22 years, she believed the entire world wanted to consume her. She had never known that a king in the north had been searching for her, not to break her, but to shield her. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now," Kalen said, his jaw tightening as he looked out the frost-covered window into the dark, "we prepare for war." The destruction of the Obsidian Hall and the slaughter of the elite Southern Lords was not a secret that could be kept. By the time the convoy crossed the heavy iron gates of the Frost Peak Citadel, the continent was in uproar. High Lord Vesper of the Ashen Vales, a cunning and ruthless tactician who had heavily invested in Oakhaven's underground markets, seized the opportunity. Vesper rallied the remaining southern and eastern lords, framing Kalen's actions as an unprovoked massacre and a declaration of continental conquest. They did not mention the Omega. They masked their greed and panic behind righteous fury. The Chronicles of the Winter Court, penned by Lady Beatrice Langley, the royal historian, noted that within a fortnight of Alicia's arrival in the north, an army of 40,000 feral and highly trained alphas marched upon the Frost Peaks. Kaelin's forces numbered barely 15,000. They were elite, hardened by the brutal northern winters, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. For the first time in her life, Alicia was given a suite of rooms that felt like a home, not a hiding place. She had velvet curtains, roaring fireplaces, and endless supplies of food. But the citadel was a beehive of frantic military preparation. The air was thick with the scent of sharpening steel, fear, and impending death. True to his word, Kaelin presented her with a map, a heavy purse of gold, and a saddled horse at the northernmost postern gate. The southern passes are blocked by Vesper's vanguard, Kaelin told her, wearing his heavy plate armor, his broadsword strapped to his back. But the winding path through the ghost canyons remains clear. It will take you to the coast. From there you can sail across the narrow sea. You will be completely out of their reach. Alicia looked at the gold, then at the horse, and finally at the Alpha King. His ice-blue eyes held a profound sadness, a stark contrast to the brutal warlord she had seen in Oakhaven. He was fully prepared to march down into the valley and die to buy her the time she needed to escape. "You cannot win this battle," Alicia said, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face. "Vesper has 3 times your numbers. They will slaughter your people." "My people are wolves of the winter," Kaelin replied fiercely. "We will make them pay in rivers of blood for every inch of snow they take. Go, Alicia, your debt is paid. Your survival is the only victory I require today." He turned away, marching back toward the war room. Alicia stood alone in the courtyard. The cold bit into her skin, but a different kind of fire was igniting in her chest. She remembered her mother's stories, whispered in the dark corners of abandoned barns. She remembered the true reason the purge had happened. The kings of old didn't fear the Omegas because they were weak. They feared them because an Omega's true power was never submission. It was command. An Omega was the beating heart of a pack, the absolute center of gravity. When an Omega unleashed their true aura, it didn't just pacify, it unified. It stripped away the chaotic, territorial aggression of alphas and forged them into a single, unbreakable weapon. She looked at the satchel of gold. She dropped it into the snow. The siege of Frost Peak Citadel began at dawn. Lord Vesper's forces poured into the valley like a tide of black iron and snarling beasts. They utilized heavy trebuchets, hurling flaming casks of pitch against the ancient stone walls of the fortress. The noise was a deafening cacophony of slaughter, steel clashing against steel, and the guttural roars of thousands of shifting wolves tearing into one another. Kaelin held the front line at the breached outer gate. He was a god of war, a whirlwind of silver and blood, cutting down Vesper's vanguard with terrifying speed. But for every 3 soldiers he killed, 5 more took their place. His elite royal guard, led by Commander Alden, formed a desperate shield wall around their king, but they were being slowly, inevitably pushed back. Fatigue was setting in. The sheer numerical superiority of the Ashen Vale's army was grinding the northern defenders into the frozen mud. From his vantage point on a rocky outcropping above the valley, High Lord Vesper watched with a cruel, satisfied smile. He knew the King of the North would fight to the death, and he was eager to mount Kaelin's head on a pike. "Press the right flank!" Vesper ordered his lieutenants. "Break their lines! I want the citadel taken before midday." Down in the mud and blood, Kaelin took a vicious slash to his shoulder, his armor buckling under the heavy strike of an enemy battle axe. He staggered, driving his sword into his attacker's chest, but his breathing was ragged. He looked around at his men, brave, fiercely loyal, but dying. The outer courtyard was lost. Suddenly, a shift occurred. It didn't begin with a sound. It began with the wind. The howling gale that swept down from the mountain peaks suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness. Then came the scent. It was no longer the faint, sweet smell of a sunlit orchard that Alicia had accidentally released in the tavern. It was a torrential, overwhelming wave of pure, concentrated power. It smelled of blooming winter roses, of ancient forests, and of an absolute, unyielding sovereignty. It hit the battlefield with the physical force of a shockwave. Every single alpha in the valley, nearly 50,000 men, froze simultaneously. Swords halted mid-swing. Jaws snapped shut. The bloodlust that fueled Vesper's feral army was instantly snuffed out, replaced by a jarring, profound confusion. Kalen ripped his gaze away from the enemy line and looked up at the high battlements of the citadel. Standing on the edge of the stone parapet, silhouetted against the rising morning sun, was Alicia Mercer. She was not wearing the heavy traveling cloak. She wore a crimson gown woven from northern wool, her dark hair cascading down her back. Her eyes, usually a soft amber, were glowing with a blinding, ethereal gold light that seemed to pierce the souls of everyone looking at her. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer suppressing her nature. She was unleashing the full, devastating magnitude of the Omega bloodline. High Lord Vesper sneered, recognizing the scent from Oakhaven. "The Omega!" he screamed at his frozen troops. "Don't just stand there. Bring down the gates. Bring her to me." His soldiers hesitated. A deep, primal instinct buried in their DNA was violently rejecting the order. The aura washing over them wasn't commanding them to surrender. It was aggressively rewriting their loyalties. Alicia raised her hands, grasping the stone of the battlements. She closed her eyes, reaching out with her mind, feeling the chaotic, fractured network of the thousands of wolves below her. She bypassed Vesper's men and focused entirely on the northern defenders, on Kalen, on the men who had bled to protect her. "Rise," she projected, not with words, but with an overwhelming, empathic surge. "Rise and be unbroken." The effect on Kalen's army was instantaneous. The fatigue, the pain, the despair, it all vanished, washed away by a euphoric surge of adrenaline and profound clarity. The northern wolves let out a synchronized, earth-shattering howl. They were no longer fighting as individual warriors. Alicia's aura had linked them into a single, flawless hive mind of tactical precision and boundless energy. Kalen felt the bond snap into place. It was a golden thread connecting his soul directly to the woman on the battlements. He felt her strength, her defiance, and her protective fury pouring into his veins. His ice-blue eyes flared with a terrifying luminescence. "For the Queen!" Commander Alden roared, his voice echoing across the silent valley. "For the Queen!" the northern army thundered in unison. The counterattack was a massacre of unprecedented proportions. Kalen's army, empowered by the ancient magic of the Omega, moved with unnatural speed and devastating coordination. They tore through Vesper's front line like a scythe through dry wheat. Vesper's soldiers, demoralized and disoriented by the conflicting instincts tearing at their minds, broke ranks. Panic consumed the Ashen Vale's army. They began to rout, throwing down their weapons and fleeing toward the southern passes. High Lord Vesper tried to rally his personal guard, screaming curses, but it was useless. The battle was lost in a matter of minutes. As Vesper turned his black stallion to flee, a massive shadow eclipsed the sun above him. Kalen Rothberg, covered in the blood of his enemies, landed in front of the High Lord. Kalen didn't bother speaking. With one brutal swing of his broadsword, he decapitated Vesper's mount, sending the warlord crashing into the frozen mud. Before Vesper could even draw a dagger, Kalen's boot came down on his chest, crushing his sternum. The Alpha King drove his sword into the earth beside Vesper's head. "Tell the shadows of the underworld," Kalen hissed, "that the North remembers." By noon, the valley was entirely secured. The surviving southern forces had surrendered unconditionally, kneeling in the blood-stained snow, submitting to the overwhelming presence of the Omega that still blanketed the citadel. Kalen walked through the courtyard, his armor dented and soaked in gore. The men parted for him, dropping to one knee in absolute reverence, not just for their king, but for the profound shift in the world order they had just witnessed. He climbed the stone stairs to the high battlements. Alicia was still there, leaning heavily against the stone, her golden eyes slowly fading back to their natural amber. The exertion of projecting her aura over such a vast distance had clearly exhausted her, but she stood tall as Kaelin approached. He stopped a few feet away, dropping his bloodied sword to the floor. The terrifying warlord, the Winter Butcher, who had just annihilated an army, sank slowly to his knees before her. He bowed his head, exposing his throat in the ultimate gesture of submission and absolute trust. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had never allowed himself to feel. Alicia stepped forward. She reached out, her delicate fingers brushing against the cold steel of his shoulder plate, tracing the line of his jaw. She could feel the bond between them, thrumming with a quiet, powerful resonance. It wasn't a bond of ownership. It was a partnership, forged in the ashes of an underground auction house and tempered in the fires of war. "I told you," Alicia said softly, a small, genuine smile breaking across her face for the first time in her life. "A queen does not belong in a cage. She belongs with her king." The age of hiding was over. The era of the Omega had returned to the world, not as a prize to be won, but as a ruler to be feared. And beside her stood the king of the Frost Peaks, the monster who burned an empire to set her free, ready to watch the rest of the corrupt world burn if they dared to challenge her reign. If you were captivated by Alicia's rise from hunted captive to the fierce queen of the Frost Peaks, don't keep this epic romance to yourself. Smash that like button, share this story with fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic werewolf tales. What did you think of Kaelin's brutal revenge at the auction house? Let us know in the comments below, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an adventure.